but I
Oh,
purposely posted a lot of video during that time, so it
right,
looked like I was very active. I'm wondering if
right.
that did something, but when I started doing my live streaming, I go to my business Facebook and LinkedIn at the same time. So, and
Yeah.
seems to
Okay,
get some good traction.
good. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll upload these after the fact at least to
Yeah.
LinkedIn. That'll give a boost. Okay, should we get started?
I think we probably should. Well,
All right, I'll give a little intro if you want, and then I'll hand it off to you, Rob. Does that
go
sound good?
ahead. Yeah, go ahead and get started.
Okay, cool. Well, welcome to Business Podcast Mastermind. We started with a few talented friends in the business podcasting space and then expanded it to create a weekly event where a wider audience can join. Give you a little bit of a bio on the members of the group. Rob Greenlee, who will be our primary host today. He's the VP of Content and Partnership at Libsyn, chair of Podcast Academy, well-known evangelist of the podcasting industry and co-host of the New Media Show audio and video podcast, which our guest has also been on from today. That airs live on Saturday and Wednesday. We've got Henry Lopez. He's a serial entrepreneur, small business coach, host of the top-rated How of Business podcast, a prolific small businessman since purchasing his first business in 1991, dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small businesses. Vinay Koshi, he's the host of Predictable B2B podcast, founder of Sproutworth. He provides content creation, content marketing, and blog management solutions and helps business owners with their marketing and sales executives achieve predictable growth by expanding their influence. And I'm Ethan Janney. I co-host the Run With It podcast. We invite 7+ figure entrepreneurs to share business ideas and the action steps to launch them. I also coach people through ambitious career moves and coach founding teams towards Fortune 500 dreams. And I'll hand it over then to Rob, who will introduce our guest today.
Well, thanks, Ethan, for the introduction. And um, we have a terrific guest here that's going to talk about advertising. She's been working pretty fervently in that area for many years now. And so we're lucky to have Heather Osgood on with us, and she is the founder and lead on a company called True Native Media. So really focuses specifically on podcast advertising. So Heather, welcome to the program here.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to
Yeah.
get to talk about one of my favorite topics, podcast advertising.
Yeah. Well, let's just go ahead and jump in and just talk generally about what are the types of advertising that are available to podcasters. Just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're all really very familiar with the idea that podcast ads are typically host read. But I always like to start with that because I feel like that's the big differentiator between any other type of advertising and podcast advertising. And really, I have a goal to preserve that in the industry. Certainly the idea of pre-recorded ads coming into the space is, it's happening and it's going to continue to happen. But the real value that podcasts bring are that host read ad. And, one of the things that I have found that I find really fascinating, and I'm sure all of you can agree upon, is that podcasters don't just take any advertiser. They really do take a look at the product. They examine whether they think that it's a valuable product. Most podcasters have spent a lot of time and energy growing their audiences, and they don't want to bring a product to their audience that wouldn't be of value. So that host is able to try the product and then, of course, give some sort of an endorsement for that product. And I really always like to encourage advertisers to think of podcast ads as being influencer marketing. That's not always something that's discussed. And I feel that it's one of the best types of influencer marketing because you have someone's voice literally inside your head and you know them, you like them, you trust them. And when they recommend a product, it can really be very powerful for the advertiser and really create great results for that advertiser. So having that host read ad is really an important piece. And then in terms of, going kind of a little deeper on the types of ads, of course, there are 3 placements for ads. Typically, there's a pre-roll, a mid-roll, and a post-roll. Pre-rolls can be a little bit different in that it could be the very first thing that you hear when you push play, or it could come right after, an introduction. let's say you welcome your listeners to the podcast and then you run the ad, whereas a mid-roll is designed to be kind of in content so that it's an ad that is, falling within, the meat of the show. So typically it's thought that a listener will be engaged in the show and be less likely to fast forward through a mid-roll ad because they're already doing something else. And then of course a post-roll falls at the very end of the show. And ad lengths can vary. They range from, I would say, 30 seconds plus. Most ads are going to be in that. I have found about a minute to a minute and a half is very average for podcast read because it is host read. So yeah, those are kind of some of the different types of ads in the podcast space.
There is a whole spectrum there, though, that's starting to develop, and I think you talked a little bit about the pre-recorded ads, right? And there are some companies that are playing around with that model around what's called programmatic advertising, and a lot of those ads typically are pre-recorded. They're probably a little bit more like what you would expect if you were to be hearing an ad, let's say on Spotify or Pandora or one of these online streaming platforms. And what's your thoughts on the encroachment of, almost like radio format type injections of advertising into podcasts? What's your philosophy on that?
Well, I think that certainly there's a place for everything. And one of the challenges that I see in the podcast space is that we literally have hundreds of thousands of listens that happen, if not millions of listens that happen all the time that go unmonetized. Right. And so I think that there really is an opportunity with pre-recorded ads. And I always kind of like to look at parallels between other industries. So, for instance, YouTube, we're all very familiar with YouTube ads where, we're getting hit up with these pre-recorded ads beginning, middle, anywhere, right, in a YouTube video. But then I'm guessing that some of us have also seen where YouTube hosts will do a host read ad for a product. And that's going to be a totally different ad and come across in a very different way. So I do think that there are places for both of them. But I really believe that if we want to hold on to the current CPMs that we have in podcasting, the host read ad is really important. And for those that aren't familiar, a CPM is cost per thousand. So essentially, how much does it cost to reach 1,000 people with an ad? And right now, CPMs in podcasting range from, I would say at the low end, probably $15, and at the upper end, they can be as much as $100 plus. And when you look at the programmatic space, typically you're talking about like $2 or, in some of the streaming audio, it's down into like single digits, right? So, you're talking $1 for 1,000 people, right? Which that's not a good number. So we really want to hold on to the value of that host read ad so we can keep the prices higher. But I also think that there can be a place for pre-recorded ads depending on how they're executed.
Yeah, I know that a lot of these platforms can enable you to turn on monetization with these dynamically inserted ads right at the start of your podcast. Now, the other challenge is that on the host read side, you typically have to build an audience first, right? Is that right?
You do. Yes, you absolutely do have to have an audience. And that sounds kind of silly, but I feel like that is something that gets overlooked. People will email me and say, I just started a podcast. I got 10 downloads. Can you sell ads? And I'll say, no, I can't. It's not going to work for us. So building your audience is really important. And even though you could maybe sign up for like a programmatic platform, like an Anchor that's just going to automatically put ads into your show, you're not going to make very much money if you haven't built a substantial audience.
Yeah. It's all about reach of your podcast. You need to build that trust relationship too, right? So when you do start running ads, they'll trust the message, right? So what gets the attention of advertisers these days, do you think, with a show?
Yeah, for sure. I know we talk a lot about how important it is that you actually have an audience, right? Like people will say, oh, you don't need very many listeners to get advertisers. And that depends, right? I always feel like that depends. It's not, you really can't go to most advertisers and say, I have 50 listeners, give me $5,000. Like it's not typically going to work that way unless you're reaching 50 of like the most unique people out there, right? If you're reaching a broad audience, you do have to have numbers. So I think that it's important to be real that your audience size is important and you need to focus on audience growth. If you're interested in monetizing your show through advertising, it is really important. But other things that are important are, consistency of content, right? So if I'm an advertiser and I'm deciding to advertise on your show, I'm going to go to your show and I'm going to make sure, oh, you actually publish on a regular basis, right? You're not publishing super sporadically. Even like down to consistency of episode length, right? Because if you've got a 5-minute episode, typically I'm going to treat that podcast very differently than I would a 60-minute podcast, right? So I think consistency of publishing, consistency of, length, and that's not to say that it has to be the exact same time, always, but somewhere between, 30 and 45 minutes. And then also how professionally you're putting everything together. You have to look at everything you're creating has a digital footprint around it. And so as an advertiser, if I'm going to go in and I'm going to check you out essentially and see if I'm going to align with Ethan and his podcast, what is that alignment going to look like? Who am I partnering with? And that doesn't mean that it always has to be super professional, depending on the type of podcast you're creating. If you're creating a comedy show and it's meant to be irreverent and, crazy, that's fine. I'm working with a brand right now called, Death Liquid. I'm getting it wrong, but something like that. It's water. And it's, it's crazy, but it's designed to be a rebellion brand. And they are fine with people who are reverent. They're looking for those people, but they still want to see that host has created some sort of a following and does have people who are going to be listening to them, and that they know when they sign up to align with this person, what they're assigning to align with. And I think now more than ever, with everything that, is happening in our world, having brands align with a podcast and vice versa can be very important. They don't want to align with a show that maybe isn't going to follow their values or their ethics or present something that could be controversial or damaging to their company. So all of those things are really important. And so creating that really good digital footprint, Liquid Death, thank you. That's what it is. It's Liquid Death. But yeah, making sure that that you are creating something that a brand can look at and say, yeah, I want to align with that podcast.
So where are we right now on minimum show size to be considered for a fully robust host read type of campaign? I mean, are those numbers dropping, or do you think that they're going up, or are they staying about the same? What do you think?
Gosh, that's a really good question. It depends a lot on whether you're doing embedded ad reads or whether you're doing dynamically inserted. So at True Native Media, we're looking for a show to have at least 10,000 downloads per episode in a 30-day period. If they're doing embedded ad reads, if they're doing dynamically inserted ad reads, we're looking for an audience size of at least 20,000, downloads per month. But I know that there are other places that, take lower numbers. I would say that 5,000 downloads per episode is a really good benchmark. And I don't know that I necessarily have seen that number dropping, but there are, I would say, increasingly, there are more platforms like, I want to say Podcorn or AdvertiseCast, where you can go and sign your show up and, they will bring you advertisers possibly, right? When you sign up on those kind of mass platforms, it's hard to say exactly how much attention your show is going to get if it's on the smaller side. But yeah, I mean, I would say that possibly anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 downloads per episode is not a bad range to start getting advertisers.
Yeah, are you seeing a difference on the ad buying side around the perception of return on investment type of scenarios for shows that are utilizing dynamically inserted pre-recorded host read ads, or the more native embed?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are we seeing a better return on the native stuff versus the dynamic stuff?
Yeah, it's really an interesting space right now, because
Mhm.
about 50% of podcasts are doing dynamically inserted ads, and about 50% do embedded ad reads.
Mhm.
And the value of the embedded ad read is that there's a long tail to it, right?
Right.
So if you're doing an embedded ad read, you're going to get the downloads for the first 30 days, but you're going to continue to get it, indefinitely.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of power in that. And what I see is that the industry has perfected the value of the embedded ad read, but the industry has not perfected dynamically inserted ads. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of host read
Mhm.
ads, and I think one of the topics that or thought processes, I should say, around dynamic insertion is that the minute you move to dynamic insertion, that means that you need to do pre-recorded ads, and that is absolutely not the case. You can definitely do host read ads that are dynamically inserted. So that's I'm a huge proponent of that. I also really believe that it doesn't matter when content is created. I think it matters when content is consumed. And so if I'm listening to a podcast today, I deserve to get an ad delivered to me. The question, and to your point, Rob, is what is the effectiveness of the dynamic insertion? And the concern I have is that I think we are taking the embedded ad read model that has been created and said, we've said, okay, well, we've been doing this with embedded ad reads. Let's just do that with dynamic too. And it doesn't make any sense. Like, for example, we had at the beginning of 2020, we had an advertiser that came to us and said, we want one ad per month on this podcast for the year. And I said, well, they just switched to dynamic insertion. So what is your plan? And they said, oh, well, okay, well, we'll just run for the month. And I said, so that means from January 1st through December 31st, you're going to run an ad on their show. So anytime I listen to this podcast for a year, I'm going to hear your ad. That's not a good plan for anybody, right? Like, let's not do that, because you need breathing room, right? You need some space in there to make sure that it gets some traction. So I really think that we're at a crossroads as an industry with dynamic insertion to try and figure out how we can make dynamic insertion as effective. And in my perspective, maybe even more effective than embedded ad reads. But I don't think that solution has really been tested out enough yet to see how we can really make dynamic ads as effective as embedded.
And it's also even a little more complex too, is that for shows that have a long tail kind of consumption pattern too, dynamic insertion can bring more value to a show. So let's say you have listeners that are listening to all your archives, but some shows aren't formatted in a way that people's listening to archives very much, right? And where's the benefit really of having the ability to trade out the ads across all your archives if nobody's listening to the archives, right? So that scenario plays into just the embedded stuff, which is just do that, and if it's in there, for the life of the episode, that's okay. I mean, what's your thoughts on that progression? Or are we seeing more, content being produced, like these storytelling podcasts that are starting to have that long tail consumption?
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of content is very evergreen, meaning that people could listen to it at any point, right? Obviously, if you're talking maybe sports or news, it's not, right? It's not going to be evergreen. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is that I hear the statistic that 80% of all downloads to an episode happen within like a 48-hour period or something. But then when I take a look at so many of the shows we have, they might get, let's say, 15,000 downloads per episode, but they're getting 100,000 downloads per month. So we know that people are going and they're listening to that back catalog content. And I don't know, I look at my own personal, use of podcasts, and I find frequently, especially if I find a new show that I'm interested in, I almost always will go into their back catalog and say, oh, they interviewed this person. I really like that person. I'm going to, take a look. Or, oh gosh, I really am working on building my email list right now. I want to listen to the episode they did about list building. So I find my personal listening does tend to be a lot of back catalog listening. So I think that it gets a little bit tricky, but I also think it depends. I think that they're two different groups of people, right? So if I'm a subscriber and I'm a very dedicated listener to your show, then yeah, I'm set to subscribe. The listens are going to, or the downloads are going to happen within that 48-hour period. But if I'm maybe more of a casual listener, then I might have more a tendency to listen to your back catalog or what appeals to me. So I think that all just goes into how effective dynamic insertion is.
Do you think that the advertiser values getting into back catalog more than new episodes?
Well, that's the thing that just fascinates. Well, I feel like that fascinates me so much because I do think that advertisers sometimes downplay back catalog listenership, and I don't understand why. So I guess, not to beat a dead horse, but the reality is that if I'm listening to the podcast today, does it matter if I'm listening to an older episode or a new episode? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess you could say, and so to answer your question, yes, that is definitely a topic that comes up. Is that listener as valuable? And I think that it does depend a ton on, several different factors. But ultimately the goal is to get in front of the same person multiple times to get them to make a buying decision. Right. And that's what dynamic insertion does. Like it takes so much longer to get frequency with embedded ad reads. So let's say I'm an advertiser and I'm going to advertise twice per month. Well, it's going to take that person 30 to 45 days to hear like that first ad, right? And then probably 30 to 45 days more. So we're talking maybe 60 days out with embedded ad reads. With dynamic, if I'm going to listen to, let's say, I don't know, several episodes over the course of the month, then I could get multiple impressions much quicker. So I think that technically dynamic should be a better buy, but it's again, figuring that algorithm out maybe.
And it's also probably sharing that information with the advertiser too, to show them, because a lot of them may not realize that too, I'm sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and unfortunately, the concept of dynamic insertion it feels like a difficult concept. I mean, I'll talk to advertisers about it on our first conversation. And then on our second conversation, I'll say, okay, now do you understand? Because some of the shows, about 50% of the shows we sell do embedded and about 50% do dynamic. So I have to educate them on both. Right. And then advertisers will be like, wait, say that again. And then they'll sign up for a contract and then they'll want me to explain it to them again. And I'm like, okay, why is this concept so difficult? But it can be.
So do you hear a different, cadence or presentation in the pre-recorded host reads versus the ones that are done more live? I mean, is there a qualitative difference between those two that you've heard, do you think?
That's a good question. And what's so fascinating to me is that I haven't done anything scientific around this, but I would say most, like probably 99% of all podcast hosts are pre-recording their ad reads anyways. I think of Andrew Warner from his podcast. I'm blanking on the name of
Mixergy.
Mixergy.
We had his producer on our first episode of this.
Oh, great. Yeah. So I know Andrew Warner does a really good job of actually integrating the ad reads into his show. Like he'll say, hey, Rob, I know I'm talking to you, but I'm going to go ahead and do an ad read right now. And what do you think of this sponsor and stuff, right? That's very rare. Number one, I think most podcast hosts don't have the ability to do that. And number two, I think a lot of times they don't feel like their audience will like that. And so most podcasts are pre-recording that ad anyways, regardless if it's embedded or if it's dynamically inserted. So it really shouldn't affect the listenership or the advertiser.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's move on and talk a little about measuring success, right? And how that's reported to advertisers, and what's important to advertisers these days. Is the IAB certification stuff important to advertisers, or are you seeing some, some wavering on how important that is?
I would say no, we are not seeing any wavering on that. I think that
Okay.
most advertisers are still very interested in IB certification, or at least compliance. I always
Right.
say it's certification or
Are you really
compliance.
compliant, though, is the question, right?
That is the question, yes.
Yes.
But so I do think that I feel like what I have seen is it used to be a really big conversation. And when I say used to be, I would say like 6 months ago, like maybe pre-pandemic, it seemed like people brought that up more. And now it doesn't feel like people bring IB certification up as frequently because they assume everyone is.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm getting more of that of like, well, of course everybody is, because why wouldn't you be? Like, that's kind of the attitude I feel like we get. But that is still really important. And then we still do see the majority of the brands advertising in this space are, centering around the direct response. We've had a number of campaigns this year that have not been direct response, more in that branding space, which is wonderful, because when you work with brands that are just looking for brand awareness, it's like a breath of fresh air, really, because
it's an easier conversation, right?
So much easier. Yeah. And they're excited. They're excited about the exposure. They're excited about, the partnership. I think that they view it more as a partnership. With direct response, it feels very transaction based. What can you do for me if you're not sending business my way right this minute? Then I'm going to cancel the buy. But direct response is still huge with the unique promo codes and or unique URLs and promo codes that are being used. And then we've got the attribution conversation that certainly is happening more and more often. I would say a lot more often.
Yeah. So any other aspects of stats or metrics? I mean, are we still living in the world of most campaigns are just looking for downloads that are coming from the US, or are you seeing some expansion into Canada and Australia and some other countries?
I would say that by and large, most advertisers are still looking to really reach the US market. But I think, gosh, we had a conversation with a company that's just been formed in the UK called Agilicious, and they are just targeting the UK and Europe. And there hasn't been, to my knowledge, besides Acast, very many companies, especially in Europe. And they're like, hey, send us all of your European, downloads, and we'll sell those. And I'm like, great, because the companies we're selling to don't want those.
Those aren't getting sold right now.
Right? So let's go ahead and sell those. Of course, that goes back to dynamic insertion and having the ability to carve out just that audience. Geo-targeting, I would say, has become much more of a conversation, especially when you're looking at agencies. You can only do all of that with dynamic insertion. But yeah, I would say it's nice to see some development. I think that there is more happening, around that, and trying to sell downloads from a variety of different regions and countries and places. So that's kind of cool to see. But really, most advertisers, and even we get a lot of advertisers actually from Europe that are looking to reach the US market. So the US really is still king, because just the size, the sheer size of the US really does tend to, hold a lot of weight.
Yeah, and also a lot of the campaigns outside of the US typically don't have very high CPMs either, right? So you have that competing against the situation. But if you have a podcast, I guess, that's got a lot of listeners, like in Europe, you're probably not going to be able to monetize that. That's the problem, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so that's why hopefully we can have more of these companies that do spring up in other places, because there is a lot of value to Canadian listeners and, European listeners and Australian listeners. And so if we can kind of service that, and we'll have podcasts sometimes will come to us from Europe and say, hey, can you represent us? And I'm like, most of your audience is not in the US, so no. So it's nice to see some growth in those areas for sure.
So when you do a campaign and then the campaign wraps up, so let's say a typical campaign is probably what, 60, 90 days probably of some sort of cadence on
Yeah.
frequency. Um, at the end of that campaign, what do you typically have to give the advertiser?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so we just kind of briefly touched on attribution, but there are three pieces that we typically look at. So the first piece is the downloads piece. So we're tracking how many downloads happened to, whether it's dynamic or whether it's embedded, how many downloads happened in that space that we promised. And we did have a lot of people's listenership dropped when the pandemic hit, and we had some advertisers who were like, gosh, we thought you were going to get 10,000 but you got 5. Let's give you some bonus spots to make up for that, right? So we are looking at downloads, and we want to make sure that we're delivering the reach that we said we would deliver. So that's really important. So that's, one piece that we're always looking at. And then the other piece that I always encourage them to look at is that internal piece. So how many conversions actually happened, if that was their goal, right? If they were looking for conversions, how many conversions actually happened? And then oftentimes we'll be talking about some sort of a multiplier, meaning that if, let's say, 10 people came to your site and made a purchasing decision using that promo code, that doesn't mean only 10 people made a buying decision. It was just meant only 10 people used the code, right?
Right.
So what kind of multiple could we assign to that to make it so that you were like, hey, 10 people use the code, but probably that means like 30 or 40 people actually came and bought something from you. So, looking at that, and that's information obviously that they have internally, but talking through that with them. And then the third piece is the attribution tracking. So I would say, gosh, probably about 25% of the campaigns that we're running now are on that attribution piece, where we're able to see kind of who has listened to the show, and through a tracking pixel, see who has converted, whether that's a conversion to come to the site or to make a purchasing decision. And then I take all those three pieces and I say, hey, these are three, different pieces of information with attribution. Not 100% of the shows are going to be on that. So these are just, three different pieces. Let's take a look at all of them to then decide whether the campaign was successful or not. And, it's really important, especially if you're working on advertisers on your own and you're not going through any sort of a firm. It's really important to make sure you're checking in with them on a regular basis, that you're providing them with anything you have, like, did you do any maybe social posts, and what kind of engagement did social posts get for you? And so did you include them in a newsletter or on your website? And can you give them any other bits and pieces to really show the advertiser that, hey, we created some traction for you here, and the engagement was good. So any of those sorts of pieces that we can provide are also really helpful.
Do you advise that the podcaster share those promo codes in other areas like social media and on their website?
You need to check in with the advertiser first. So depending on who the advertiser is, they may or may not want the promo codes out there. You should definitely put them on your website. But social media gets a little bit tricky because there are couponing sites out there like Retail Me Not. And what happens is those codes get picked up and placed on these couponing sites. And then the advertiser can't track the performance through just your podcast. So if the goal is for the advertiser to determine whether or not your podcast was successful and everybody used the Retail Me Not code, then it's hard to say if it really was successful or not. So I always recommend that you check in with the advertiser first and see how they feel about it. In social media, you could do something like, hey, we've got this great promotion. You could get 30% off. Go to my website to find the code, or you could allude to it in a different way instead of actually putting it in there. But so you have to be a little bit conscientious about that.
Right. So to talk a bit about kind of brand campaigns, what is the metric that you see that's most important to the advertiser? Are they looking at brand lift studies? Are they how are they evaluating a campaign on a podcast when there's no promo code or a direct response kind of thing? Just curious.
Yeah. So there are lift studies that can be done. True Native Media hasn't done any yet, but that is an option. So, people could take a look at that. But I would say most of the time, what the company is really looking for, really more than anything, is a quality ad read. If they know that your reach is a certain amount, right? So you're getting a certain number of downloads, and they can see that you've really created a quality ad read, that's what they're looking for. And so really more than anything, it's just knowing that their messaging is getting out. And it's a lot of times it's this combination, right? So you want the host to speak from a very authentic, organic place about their experience with a product or service, but you also are looking for, we have, the company has a unique selling proposition that they're looking to get out. They have, maybe I find that with branding, it's mostly does center a lot around education. So how are we educating the public? And if you can find a company that's main goal is really to bring education, then as long as the host is able to convey, put their spin on it and give their endorsement, as well as really convey the main points of the brand, that they're going to be happy with that. So that's what we find. Yeah.
Do you see that as you look to the future that brand buys might go across larger numbers of shows? I'm just curious.
I absolutely think that they will. I think
Mhm.
what's really interesting is that I think we're in a space right now where, statistically only 30 to maybe 40% of the population actively listen to podcasts, right?
Mhm.
So if you think about the breakdown of a marketing department at a company, what I find most often is the people I speak with are the person in that department that's like, I love podcasts. They're the best. We
Mhm.
have to advertise on podcasts, right? And so they go to their team, or first they come and talk to me and they say, we should do podcasts, right? And I say, yeah, you should.
Right.
Then they have to go back to their marketing department and they have to sell them on the value of podcasting. And I think that in some ways it's a bit of an uphill battle, because how many of us use Facebook? Oh gosh, 99% of us, or whatever, right? Like,
Right.
so in a marketing department, it's probably not difficult to sell a marketing department on Facebook ads because everybody understands them. But when
Right.
everybody doesn't understand podcasting, sometimes it feels like this, like, oh, it's like, oh yeah, I'm in marketing. I should understand podcasts. I should know. And so the marketing person maybe feels that way, but really doesn't actually embrace the medium.
Mhm.
And I think we're always going to have a bit of an uphill battle because of that. But I do think that one of the things that's so fascinating about podcasts is that when you look at social media, people literally spend seconds on ads or any content on
Mhm.
social media. When you look at YouTube, it's minutes, right? People watch videos for minutes. But when you look at how long people listen to podcasts, I mean, it's like 30 plus minutes. You probably know the stat off the top of your head, Rob. I
Wow.
should.
It's
But
it's like 30 plus. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
30 plus minutes. So when you look at the level of engagement that happens on podcasts, it is hands down better than almost anything else that's happening out there, right? And so it's so valuable. This engagement, this influence that happens with podcasts is so important and so valuable. And so I do really believe the results will ultimately speak for themselves. And as more and more marketing departments see what kind of results they can create. And truthfully, as these brands, these companies are so burnt out on social media ads. They've
Right.
been throwing all this money at social and they're like, please, is there another option? Is there something else we can do? And so, I think podcasts can be that answer. And the more that we can kind of break into all of those marketing departments and show
Mhm.
the value of podcasting, the more brand advertising will be out there.
Yeah.
And
Me
the better
cut
the
in here real
metrics
quick.
get.
Yeah.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
Yeah.
So we're at about 15 minutes out here. Just wanted to share a couple of things. One, I put a link in there for if people want to sign up next week to join us. And next week, what we'll do is we'll take this topic that we covered, advertising and advertisers, and work through some action steps that we'll assign today. And also just kind of take more questions, open the discussion to the other hosts that we have here,
Right.
and work through some things for listeners. So you can sign up for that. There's also a feedback form. I'm going to just put one action step out there, and also just interested in Heather's feedback if you have any ideas on what people can do. But I'm thinking something that would work for my situation. We're still growing our podcast, but just to make a list of maybe 5 to 10 advertisers to start kind of taking it. We don't do advertising yet, but to take it seriously, and maybe think of maybe half of them being sort of on the larger end, just so that, because I'll be more familiar and say this would be a good fit for our show, but maybe some niche, try to find some niche brands that would be like, oh, this is kind of the perfect podcast. You think that would be a good step for someone getting into advertising?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you know that you already love a product, well, what I would recommend is, create those lists. And like you said, create some that are large. But I do find oftentimes people go too large and they think, oh, Microsoft has tons of money, they should advertise on my show. But the reality is it's going to be much, much harder to get Microsoft. So like you had Fiesta, Rob said you were on that Fiesta. A company like that would be a perfect type of company to get as an advertiser, because they're looking to get exposure. They're not looking for you to have, an audience of 1 million, and you could come up with something that would be really great. So I would say make a list and try to make it as realistic as possible. And then what you could do is you could even highlight their company in some of the content you're creating, right? Like, we use Restream. We love Restream. This is why it's been so great. We recommend it. Or, maybe you just create that as just organic content. And then you approach Restream and you say, hey, Restream, we love you so much. Look, we even talked about you in one of our episodes. So you're creating something for them to dig their teeth into a little bit. But the other thing that I think people overlook a lot that I highly recommend, and I know Buzzsprout has a system for this on their platform, but is affiliate marketing. I think affiliate marketing is a really good place to start if you don't have advertisers, because there are so many different affiliate programs you can sign up for out there. And number one, it trains you as a podcaster what it's like to have advertisers. What is it like to really create a good, solid ad read? It really educates your audience about, hey, you could expect ads from me. It helps you format your show in a way to accommodate ads. And then it also gives you some concrete metrics as to what kind of conversions you're getting. Because with affiliate marketing, for sure, 10 people signed up for this last month because I got paid for 10 people, right? And then you can take that information, go to a paid advertiser and say, hey, Mr. Advertiser, look, this is how my show performs. These are some examples of other ads and other companies we've worked with. So affiliates can be a really good place to start.
It's also, affiliates are a great place to start too. Just keep in mind when you're doing affiliate stuff, you have to really focus on driving people to the transactional URLs for that relationship, else you won't get credit for it. So you have to figure out a way to get those listeners to actually go to where you want them to go, or to click on a link, or to transact on that with your particular relationship with them. So so you get proper credit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hey,
Ethan,
add a question here.
Go ahead,
Henry,
go ahead.
It was just another idea for next week, and then I'll be happy to share mine next week, is starting to think about your pitch deck. So I know when I get approached by an advertiser to sponsor, I've got a pitch deck that summarizes my stats and my audience and who my listener is. So that's something that might be something for people to start on as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Let me pop in with the question that we had along the way from Harpreet. And he said, should we add a premium to embedded ads when sending out proposals, in terms of sending out proposals and pitching?
Such a good question. And that's like certainly a bigger question that the industry is having, is should embedded ads cost more than dynamically inserted? And At True Native Media, we price them the same. And I would say part of the reason that we price them the same is not because I don't think embedded ads are worth more, but because we really are trying to show the industry that dynamic insertion has value.
Right. Yeah.
So that being said, one of the biggest issues I have with embedded ad reads is, how is it fair for you as a podcaster to get paid for your ad to appear once, and for the advertiser to get the results for that ad to be listened to many more times than they actually paid for? And so, yes, so to answer your question, Harpreet, yes, you probably could and should pay more for embedded ad reads. And I think as you're talking to advertisers, emphasizing the fact that where else can they place an ad and get that ad listened to over and over again. And if you happen to have a guest, on that week's episode, maybe you typically get, let's say, 2,000 downloads per episode, but you got this guest on and now all of a sudden that episode's at 10,000 because they shared it or what have you, right? So that episode can be worth a ton to them. So I don't think it's a bad idea.
Well, that's also what the long-term benefit is to even a brand advertiser, right? Is that they're building name awareness for that customer, potentially choose them for something that they may buy 6 months from now, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that they just heard last week on a podcast episode. It's something that got brand embedded into their mind after many frequency of impressions that will ultimately turn into a purchase in the future. So in some ways, the brand advertising is a ad campaign to buy transactions beyond the window of the advertiser into the future. Yeah.
Yep, for sure.
Any other input from Henry on the discussion? And
I just want to note is that next week, definitely, I was just jotting down furiously some notes and numbers. And I can tell you that for myself, I've been selling sponsorships for a couple of years now. And at this point, I'm averaging about 3,200 to 3,500 downloads per episode after 30 days. And even when I was doing a lot less than that. Now, again, I'm not going to get rich off of this, but the way I've always looked at it is it subsidizes my production costs. But I'm going to be looking forward to share those numbers next week. As if you're listening to this thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to be a while before I get to the numbers that Heather's been sharing with us. There is an opportunity for us at lower numbers as well.
Right.
As I'm sure Heather has seen. She was sharing general numbers, but there is opportunity there. And a lot of it is what Heather talked about, positioning those things that make us unique, our engagement with our audience. Certainly how long your show has been out on a consistent basis, as Heather articulated, I think has been one of the keys to why I've been able to consistently land sponsorships. But I'll share some of those stats next week on our follow-up show.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm. I also think, just to piggyback on that when you are working with a representation firm, so like True Native Media, for instance, we make a percentage of what we sell. And when I go to an advertiser, if I have 10 different podcasts, I need all of those 10 different podcasts to have some sort of a similar pricing basis, right? I can't say, well, Henry's show is a $200 CPM, but Ethan's show is a $10 CPM and Rob's is a $5 CPM. And then they say, why, right? Like, why? What about Henry's show is so much more valuable than Rob's? But so if you're going on an individualized basis to sponsors and advertisers, you absolutely, I think, can get advertisers sooner and get paid more for them, because you have the ability to sell that advertiser on why you in particular are unique and special and can do a lot for them, where I can't do that because I have too many people to contend with and I have to make a story that makes sense. So you can sell advertisers on your own much sooner than a representation firm could sell for you.
Agreed.
Also want to just add, at this point too, we want to, if anybody in the audience, you're welcome to sort of unmute yourself. If you have something you want to interject, we can open it up a little bit, or you can continue to write questions in the chat. I have a question here that came from Stephanie, and I thought I had the answer, but I just want to verify. She said, is a pitch deck the same thing as a media kit? And Henry mentioned like a pitch deck for advertisers.
Yeah, I would consider it the same thing. It's whatever is going to help you communicate and sell your show to that potential advertiser, sponsor, whatever you want to call it. I have both. I have a media page, and of course, you go to my site, there's a page for sponsors that has some of that same content. But what I have found is often when I get an inquiry, they'll ask me for details or stats. And so I send them that pitch deck that includes my structure, my pricing, my stats all in one. And that seems to kind of do the job for me of pitching my show. And again, it could just be a website page. You don't have to get too complicated with that. We talked about last week and the week before about going from one sheets to a media page, whatever's easiest for you. But you whatever it is or whatever method you're going to use to sell your show and why you should be considered as by an advertiser.
Mm-hmm. I would say just make sure you have something. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Harpreet.
Yeah, I think go for it, Harpreet.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, guys. So let's say that we find a company that we really see ourselves aligning with and we think would be a great fit for our audience. How would we go about finding the person to contact in order for us to get a conversation going on sponsorship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you can do it a few different ways. So what I would recommend is I think LinkedIn is your best friend when you're trying to sell ads. So go to LinkedIn and find the company and then look for the marketing person at that company. So usually if you just typed in, like if I went and typed in Restream marketing, then I'm going to usually, yeah, that could come up with somebody. But if you go to Restream's page on LinkedIn, then you can see how many employees work there. And if you click on employees, then it'll give you a list. And if you can find the person that works in marketing, then you know that that's the person. So you could message them through LinkedIn. But there are several email finder tools out there because every company has the same format for their email address. Not every company, but 99% of them, once you find the format, you can just extrapolate it. So then you know that it's like first name dot last name at restream.com, and then you can send them an email that way. So if you just type in like email finder in Google, Hunter.io is one that I like and use a lot. Or it's where I kind of started. So you can message them through LinkedIn. You can try to extrapolate their email address. I don't usually ever recommend people to go to like the info at address or fill out the contact form on their website. That's usually not going to get you anywhere. And then just real briefly, and because I know we need to wrap it up, the other thing is engaging with them on social media, because the person doing social media posts for them is also in the marketing department. So if you can engage with them on several posts on social media and then say, hey, just to let you know, I sent you a message. Can you check that? Put that in the comments and then go, and send them a message through social media. So that can be another way to get to the marketing person.
Yeah. That's great.
Great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah.
Harpreet, just curious, or if anybody else wants to jump in with something, but just kind of getting a sense, where are you at in terms of your next steps? Are you thinking for podcast advertising?
So I've joined Heather's awesome course, and it's been very
nice.
helpful in kind of orienting myself and figuring out what to do next. So I've only been in the podcast game for about 5 months, and I feel like I've gotten some good traction so far, and I'm just starting to go out and look for advertisers.
Excellent.
That's
Great.
great.
I didn't know you had a
Yeah.
course, Heather. Nice little plug here. I'm seeing how these kind of things that you're talking about can be done, right? You're just talking about little products and services and things that really just fall natural. It's not like you're trying to plug things, right? And then you say, hey, they could be a sponsor, right? Or we could put an affiliate link to that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. In the last minute, if you care to, Adrian, are you interested in sharing where you're at?
Yeah. So guys, for me, the CX Chronicles podcast, it was really primarily about customer experience, customer service, customer success oriented professionals. And where I've gotten to at this point, Ethan, now is like a big part of what I've been building out over the last couple of months is really getting a super firm understanding of like the top 50 CX SaaS providers out there in the world. And when you look at this list and then you start to look at revenue, number of employees, and then you kind of dork out a little bit further and see where their tentacles have reached from a marketing perspective. I think for me over the next month or two, a big goal that I'm kind of ripping through is, number one was just learning because I already know my audience. My audience is literally the people that buy that software. So I kind of knew from day one when I started this thing that eventually, if I could get through it, that there would be a lot of value just in terms of the decision holders that listen to my show every single week. And so for me, it's kind of figuring out, there's about probably like a quarter of the list I've actually used the software. So I can actually truly say something candid about whether I think it's awesome or whether I think it sucks. And I think that I would prefer to work with some of the softwares that are better. I think the problem is in my world, like to try to talk to like Zendesk or Freshworks, these guys they've got a lot of people that are already willing to do things for free for them. So just to be able to, and like they've invited me to their webinars and some of that, which is awesome, because then like you do see download upticks and you get a bunch of inbounds on days when you get to go do a Zendesk webinar with 500 CX pros. So that's cool. And I always say yes to that. But I think it's just a matter of figuring out which of these top 50 CX providers are looking for someone who, they know they've already curated a stable of decision makers for the people that are going to buy that software. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting space to be. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I just noticed too we're at time, so anyone and everyone can jump off if you want at the moment. If anybody has a final comment to make, feel free. Otherwise, I mean, Heather, you're welcome to say, "Hey, I got a piece out." Let us know.
Yeah, no.
We'll
Do
be
you
off
guys
in a
have
couple minutes.
one more quick minute? Can I give Adrian just a little bit of
I
feedback?
do. Yeah,
Sure.
go for it.
Yeah.
Rob, you can
Yeah.
jump off if you need to.
Yeah, okay.
Go for it.
Go ahead.
So Adrian, what you might think about when it comes to sponsors, because I totally hear what you're saying, is instead of going after those companies to sponsor your shows, you might think about any like secondary companies that support those. So, maybe just do some brainstorming around, okay, if we know that my listener is going to be somebody who is, looking at the CX stuff, who is that secondary or third tertiary company that could, want that same audience or support that, you might have more success there.
Okay. Super helpful.
So, yeah, maybe think about that, but thank you guys so much
Perfect.
for having me on. This has been so much fun. And I do encourage you guys all next week to, listen to what Henry has to say, because I think having a good pitch deck, having a good media kit is super important and a really good place to start for advertisers.
That's all good. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Rob, any final words or?
No,
you
this
ready
is
to hop off?
great. Let's keep growing this thing. It's fantastic.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, we'll
Thanks,
see
guys.
everyone next week.
Appreciate it.
See you
Thank
later,
you.
Adrian.
Yep.
See you later, Stephanie. Thank you, Heather. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Heather. Okay.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye.